The first time I tried to take a picture with him, he wasn't there, just me smiling awkwardly at the camera with an empty space beside me where seconds earlier he had been leaning his head close to mine, whispering that the night breeze smelled like jasmine because it matched my perfume, and I remember my stomach tightening as I stared at the screen because the hallway lights flickered at that exact moment, throwing long shadows behind me while I stood frozen, wondering if the camera glitched or if I imagined him entirely. But then I felt his warm breath on the back of my neck and heard him laugh softly, asking why I looked like I'd seen a ghost, though the irony of that didn't hit me until much later when everything spiraled out of control. But that night I simply slipped my phone into my pocket and forced a smile, pretending nothing was wrong as we walked down the dimly lit sidewalk, his uniform reflecting the yellow streetlights, his badge shining faintly with the letters HOA. And he was telling me how our neighborhood was full of strange incidents, but how he was always around to make sure I got home safely, even though I never saw him patrolling anyone else's house, and honestly I didn't care because I liked the way he made me feel, safe but excited, nervous but comforted, like there was something beautifully dangerous about him I couldn't name, and whenever he smiled that half smile with the tiny scar cutting through his upper lip my heart would flip inside my chest. But later that night when he stood at my doorstep and told me good night, I pretended to go inside but watched him from behind the window curtain because I wanted to see where he went next, except he didn't walk away like a normal person, he just kind of drifted backward until the darkness swallowed him, and the porch light blinked twice like the whole street was holding its breath, and the next morning I went to the HOA office to ask who the new patrol officer was because I thought maybe I could learn something about him. Maybe find out why he chose to walk only with me, but the woman at the front desk frowned and told me they hadn't hired anyone new for months, and when I described him, his height, his calm voice, his strangely familiar smile, she stiffened and typed something quickly into her system before turning the screen away like she didn't want me to see it, then said quietly, "There is no HOA patrol boy matching that description," and insisted maybe it was a prank, maybe someone pretending to be patrol for reasons I shouldn't question. But her eyes were trembling as she spoke, and when I pushed again, she lowered her voice and told me to stop walking with strangers because people disappear around here when they get too close to the wrong things. Yet that night he came again, leaning casually against the lamppost outside my door, greeting me as if nothing had happened while I stood frozen wondering who, or what, I was letting into my life. But he looked at me with those dark, soft eyes and somehow all my fear collapsed, and once again I let him walk beside me, let him make me laugh, let him shield me from the cold wind, and when I reached for my phone again to take another photo, determined to understand the truth, he didn't say no, didn't stop me, just stood there smiling softly like he already knew what would happen, and when the flash burst across his face, I felt his fingers graze my hand, warm and steady, but the moment I checked the picture he was gone again, replaced by the same empty space, the same eerie shadow, the same proof that something was very, very wrong. Yet he gently touched my elbow and said, "Sometimes pictures lie, but I don't," and the sincerity in his voice made me believe him even though everything inside me screamed that the lie was much bigger than I understood, and I walked home with him again that night, fully aware that I was stepping deeper into something I couldn't explain. After that second vanishing photo, something inside me shifted, not exactly fear, not exactly trust, but an aching curiosity that pulled me toward him even harder. So the next night when I found him already waiting near the mailbox as if he sensed my thoughts before I stepped outside, I didn't bother pretending anymore. I marched right up to him and asked why he didn't appear in pictures, and he smiled gently like he was expecting the question and said, "Maybe your phone just doesn't like me." But there was something behind his eyes, something guarded and old, like he was carrying a truth too heavy to share yet too painful to hide, and all evening I watched him more closely than usual, noticing strange small things, how his footsteps made no sound on the pavement, how the cold night air never made him shiver, how street dogs barked at empty space beside me instead of at him, how his shadow stretched farther than mine even though we were under the same light, and each new detail wrapped around my heart like a silent warning. Yet each time he laughed softly or looked at me with quiet warmth I felt my fear dissolve, replaced by an inexplicable longing to understand him, to keep him close even if he wasn't entirely real. And that night I finally asked him his name because I realized I'd never heard him say it, and he paused for a long moment before whispering, "Call me Aris," almost like the name tasted bittersweet, and as we walked he told me stories about the neighborhood, how the old oak tree used to be a meeting place for kids long before the HOA was built, how the streetlights were replaced after a strange blackout years before, how certain houses felt colder than others because they held memories no one wanted to remember, but he never talked about himself, never shared where he lived, where he went during the day, or why he only showed up at night, and when I pressed, he gently touched my wrist and said, "Some things are easier to believe in the dark, and for reasons I still can't explain." That sentence hit me so deeply I felt tears sting my eyes, but later that night when I got home I couldn't sleep, so I opened my laptop and searched old HOA records, old patrol lists, old incident reports, typing keywords like, HOA patrol boy, accident, missing worker, anything that might give me a hint, and after hours of searching I found it. A blurry scanned report from 6 years ago about a young patrol officer who died during a night inspection after entering a restricted zone behind the clubhouse, but the name was smudged, the photo ripped, and half the report blacked out, yet the scar on the officer's lip, faintly visible through the tear, was the same scar Aris had, and my hands shook so hard I nearly dropped the laptop, but instead of fear clawing through me, it was grief for someone I somehow loved even if I had no right to. And the next night I confronted him, holding the printed report in trembling hands, demanding to know who he really was, but he didn't get angry, didn't deny it, he simply looked at me with hollow sadness and said, "I wasn't supposed to stay, but you make it hard to leave," and when he touched my face his fingers were colder than they had ever been, as if he was fading, and he told me the HOA had rules for the dead who lingered, rules he had broken the night he stepped out of the restricted zone to protect a girl from danger. Rules that kept him trapped in the neighborhood, unseen by cameras, unseen by anyone except the person he felt tied to, me, and I didn't understand how or why, only that he was disappearing more every night, and I didn't want to lose him, so I held his hands tightly and whispered that I didn't care what he was, I didn't care about the HOA or rules or cameras, I just didn't want him gone, but he stepped back slowly, his body flickering like static, and said that loving someone like him comes with a cost I wasn't ready to pay, and as he faded into the darkness I realized the truth was simple. Some people come into our lives to protect us, not to stay with us, and sometimes the love we choose is the love we cannot keep, but the love that keeps us safe even after it's gone. After discovering that he vanished from photos and realizing the HOA had no record of someone like him, I started noticing details I had overlooked before. Small things that didn't make sense but somehow felt normal when he was near me, like how he always appeared exactly when the HOA patrol siren clicked off at midnight, how he always walked on the side of the street where shadows were thicker, how he never opened doors but somehow ended up inside hallways before me, and how every time I tried touching him in a brightly lit area, his hand felt colder than the air around us, as if he absorbed the temperature instead of giving it warmth, and the more I watched him, the more signs I saw. No footsteps in freshly watered grass, no reflection in glass windows, no sound of breathing even when the nights were quiet enough to hear leaves turning, yet emotionally he felt more real than anyone I had ever known, and each time he said my name it felt like he was saying it for the first time after waiting years just to speak it out loud, and that feeling confused me because deep down I knew I shouldn't fall for someone who seemed to exist only between shadows and silence. But the heart doesn't care about logic, it only reacts to presence, and his presence made me feel like I mattered in ways no living person ever made me feel, but small questions began piling up in corners of my mind like dust I kept ignoring. Why did he only stay until exactly 3:17 a.m.? Why did the HOA clubhouse lights flicker whenever he walked past? Why did old neighbors stare into the darkness behind me during our late walks like they sensed something following, something they couldn't see but feared anyway? So one night, determined to understand him, I asked again where he lived and he avoided the question, telling me he prefers the quiet parts of the neighborhood, the forgotten areas no one visits anymore, and when I asked why, he simply said, "It's safer for me there," which sent a chill through me because who needs safety from the living unless they aren't part of the living themselves, but I didn't want to accuse him, didn't want to push him away, so I followed him that night without telling him, walking a few steps behind, staying silent as he drifted through the neighborhood with unnatural calmness until he reached the abandoned HOA storage building near the back fence. the one covered in warnings and sealed with chains no one ever touches, and he walked straight through the locked door, not breaking it, not opening it, just passing through it, and I covered my mouth to keep from screaming, but instead of running, I pressed my ear to the cold metal door and heard nothing, just empty silence, no footsteps, no movement, no sound of someone inside, and when I stepped back, the porch lights of the clubhouse flickered 3 times like a silent alarm was being triggered, and the HOA security cameras turned toward me as if they were eyes watching, catching, recording, but I didn't understand why until I saw a document taped loosely to the side of the building, half torn, half burned, a report titled, Night Restriction Violation Incident, and under it, a faint name smudged in ink, Aris, followed by the words, Physical Form Compromised, and, Remain within restricted perimeter, and before I could read more, the wind ripped the paper away and I heard his voice behind me, softer than usual, saying, You shouldn't be here. And when I turned around, he was standing too close, his outline flickering like a weak light bulb, his eyes worried but nostalgic, as if he had known this moment would come from the first night we spoke, and even though I wanted to scream, I didn't, because the fear didn't outweigh the ache of wanting him to tell me the truth at last. He didn't disappear the way he usually did that night, instead he stayed, letting the heavy silence thicken between us until he finally exhaled, though no visible breath left his lips, and he whispered that he wasn't supposed to be out here with me, that every time he stepped beyond the old HOA storage building he risked fading more, losing pieces of himself he couldn't get back, but he couldn't stop coming because something about me pulled him forward like a memory he had forgotten but couldn't let go, and he told me the truth in fragments at first, how he had been on patrol years ago, responding to a call about a strange noise behind the clubhouse, how he entered a restricted zone that wasn't meant for anyone to enter, a place the HOA had sealed after an unexplained event that still left the land colder than the rest of the neighborhood, and how something happened that night, something he couldn't describe except that it tore him from his body but didn't let him leave, trapping him between worlds, making him visible only to those who felt what he called the pull. And I didn't know what that meant until he gently touched my cheek and said I was the first person who ever saw him after he died, the first person whose presence anchored him enough to speak, to appear, to exist again in the thin space between the living and the forgotten, and hearing that broke something inside me because it meant he was not alive, not fully, not in any way that could last, but it also meant I mattered to him in a way I never mattered to anyone, so I asked why the HOA kept records of him if they told me he didn't exist. And he said the HOA knew he was trapped but preferred to pretend he wasn't because acknowledging him meant accepting what the restricted zone actually did, and they feared panic, investigation, and exposure, so they kept him hidden, erased his name, erased his reports, erased his face from every file, and when he said all this, his body flickered faster, his voice fading, his shape bending like smoke in wind, and I realized that each night he spent with me made him weaker because he was supposed to stay within the restricted boundary, but he stepped out every night anyway just to walk me home, just to make sure I wasn't alone, just to feel something again, something human, something warm, something close to love, and I felt tears slip down my face as I begged him to stop coming to me if it was killing what little of him was left, but he shook his head and held my hands, his touch flickering like static electricity, and said he didn't care about rules, didn't care about fading, didn't care about the boundary, because loving me felt like the first real thing he'd felt in years, and he would rather lose himself in pieces than return to the hollow silence of the restricted zone. But then his voice cracked as he said, if I fade completely, I can't come back, and something inside me shattered, because love should never feel like choosing between existence and disappearance. Yet here we were, caught in a love that neither the living nor the dead were allowed to keep, and as he flickered harder, nearly transparent, I pulled him close even though my arms passed halfway through his fading form, and I whispered that I didn't want to be the reason he vanished forever, and he smiled sadly, said, "You're the reason I lived again," before stepping backward toward the shadows where he was safer, where he wouldn't fade as quickly, and as he slowly disappeared into the cold air, he told me, some love isn't meant to save us, it's meant to remind us we're human, and I stood alone in the darkness, realizing the truth. Some people come into our lives not to stay, but to show us what we were too afraid to feel, and the hardest love to let go of is the kind that was never meant to last.